Hi, Hannah. It's good to see you again, and it's a busy time to be a correspondent in your region as well.
Yes, very, very busy. It's been an interesting and very long week.
A very long week, and we're going to cover some of the machinations of this story because it just keeps developing. But for now, there is a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. You're in Delhi. Can you give us a sense of how it feels there, what the mood is, what people are telling you?
There's a kind of general sense of relief at this all kind of being resolved. On Saturday, when we woke up to news of Indian missiles soaring towards Pakistan, of Pakistan missiles targeting dozens of sites across North India, it felt very much like these were two countries that were on the brink of war, and it would be very difficult to pull them back from that. So the fact that, within a few hours of that, by the evening, a ceasefire had been agreed was just, yeah, I think a lot of people here were very worried about war. But there was also a huge contingent of people who really wanted this, had really kind of got, I guess, very worked up and were kind of very gung-ho about kind of, showing more aggression to Pakistan. And there are some quarters that are disappointed in the ceasefire and kind of angry about it. But I would say most of all, the feeling here is in both Pakistan and India, they've kind of declared this as a victory for both sides. Modi made a speech saying we defeated Pakistan and we showed them, our strength.
आने वाले दिनों में हम पाकिस्तान के हर कदम को इस कसौटी पर मापेंगे कि वो क्या रवैया अपनाता है। भारत पर आतंकी हमला हुआ तो मुंह तोड़ जवाब दिया जाएगा।
So a lot of people here have this kind of sense of national pride afterwards. They feel like, India did kind of show its enemy, who was the boss.
And what are you hearing from your colleagues in Pakistan as well? Because you're working closely with them. Is there that similar sense of mixed feelings, relief, but from some quarters wanting it to go on a bit?
It's very much been portrayed as a victory for Pakistan. They're saying we showed India, India's got an army double the size of Pakistan's, and, they're very proud of the fact that they claim to have shot down 5 Indian military jets. But what I would say in Pakistan is that there was less of an appetite for this to become war than there was in India. The narrative constantly was that India was kind of goading Pakistan into this, that this wasn't a war that Pakistan wanted. And it was Pakistan who was very much kind of reaching out to the international community from the beginning. So whilst on the ground, I think people, feel very proud, as they would say, that, I guess Pakistan kind of took these very strong military actions, that they did launch missiles into India. They launched hundreds of drones. And the narrative, again, from the army, from the prime minister, is that, we showed India our strength. We defeated them when they kind of unfairly came up against us. But I would say there, in Pakistan, more broadly, people there really didn't want a war.
I know that Narendra Modi has said this is only a pause in military action. So I imagine there's apprehension about whether the ceasefire will hold. But just looking overall what's been happening, is this the most dangerous moment for some time between India and Pakistan? Because there has been conflict in the past.
It's definitely still very fragile, and I think Modi's comment is interesting. I think there is a sense here that this was possibly a ceasefire that was pushed for by the US and with US pressure, which is something I'm not sure that India actually likes very much, because that was something that Pakistan wanted. I'm not sure it's something necessarily that India wanted. And as I said, there were some quarters in India, particularly amongst the Modi supporters, who are very hardline, very pro-nationalist, who didn't want this to be a ceasefire. And so I think when Modi was saying it's a pause, he was kind of speaking to those in his base. And there are still a lot of questionable issues here. And there is a sense that, any kind of rogue firing along the fragile border or any sense of mobilization could re-trigger it instantly. So it doesn't feel like the danger has passed at all. And I think until the two sides sit down and meet properly and kind of come to some renewed agreement, because a lot of the treaties that were governing borders, the Shimla Agreement, the Indus Water Treaty, things that governed kind of water and, the line of control, they were suspended during this conflict and they haven't been reinstated. So, the kind of rules that governed how India and Pakistan coordinated with each other on both military and kind of social issues have not been resolved at all.
We are going to get into some of the detail, especially how the US helped resolve this. But if we can just zoom out for a moment and just remind us why India and Pakistan are still in conflict over this territory of Kashmir.
So Kashmir has always been the most sensitive point between India and Pakistan. It goes back to 1947 with the partition of India and the formation of Pakistan. And when the kind of borderline was being decided, Kashmir is, this kind of always been this kind of revered part of India before partition. And, it's this kind of rolling, beautiful Himalayan region. It has a very distinctive culture, a very distinctive identity. It's a predominantly Muslim region. And in partition, there was this kind of huge dispute over whether or not it would join India or Pakistan.
This is partition when Pakistan was created.
Exactly, yeah. So this is when India, after Indian independence, a separate state was created for India's Muslims, essentially. That was the kind of idea, that the Muslim community of India needed their own country, and that was how Pakistan came about. In the first war these two countries ever fought, pretty much as soon as with the formation of Pakistan, was over Kashmir. And since that point,
they've 80 years ago.
It was, 1947. And, not much has moved on since then. I mean, they, in terms of the kind of animosity, in terms of that anger, in terms of the sense that from both sides that this is a region that they should be ruling in full. And since that point, they've fought 3 wars in total over it. It remains split between India and Pakistan. And there is a border called the Line of Control, which is not seen as a kind of internationally recognized border, which is kind of where a lot of the issues have arisen. It's where most of the kind of on-the-ground aggressions in this conflict took place. It's where the most people died. And, Kashmir on the Indian side for the past kind of 30 years almost has had this kind of violent militant insurgency, which is said to be backed by and funded by Pakistan.
And that because most people in India and administered Kashmir sort of want either to be part of Pakistan or they want some sort of autonomy. Is that right?
Well, these groups want to be part of Pakistan. Within Kashmir, there is a sense more that their own identity, they kind of want to be left alone. But people, it's now got to this point where you don't go there and people don't say, "Oh, we want to be part of Pakistan," but they certainly don't want to also be in the middle of this constant push-pull between the two countries. There is a lot of anger towards the Indian government in Kashmir because of the way in which the insurgency was crushed, the human rights abuses that have taken place there, the fact that it's in one of the most militarized zones in the world. And this kind of oppression was amped up very much under the Modi government in 2019 when he took away this kind of autonomy that Kashmir had, which was seen to protect its national identity, its culture, kind of give it this, separate status essentially from the rest of India. He dismantled that, brought the whole of the region under central government control, and
this is the part of he brought Indian administered Kashmir, like that half that
Indian
you see on the map
Kashmir,
under
yes,
his
sorry.
control. It is really confusing.
Exactly. It's very confusing. You talk about Kashmir here, you're just talking about the Indian Kashmir, but in Pakistan, it's obviously a different question altogether. But Modi and the government still see the whole of Kashmir as part of India. And same on the other side. And so, whilst there is this border dividing the two, it's still very contentious.
Conflict, yes. So against all of that background, there was this latest flashpoint that happened in late April, where mostly Hindu tourists in Indian-administered Kashmir were killed by militants. Why did India say that Pakistan was to blame for that?
So this is a kind of historic allegation that India has, and it's one that has proved to be true. There are Pakistani militant groups based out, and there are militant groups based out of Pakistan that use Pakistan as a base that have conducted some of the worst terror attacks on India, the Mumbai attacks, the Mumbai train bombings. Within Kashmir, these groups have carried out militant attacks on, army personnel. And it's a kind of well known that they have these, and the main 2 groups are Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they are known to operate within Pakistan. Like they have been operating there, for a long time. The question is, how much they are involved in these current attacks. That's unclear. But, India's allegation that these were Pakistan-backed militants comes from a long history of Pakistan bankrolling, giving these militants training, giving them support as a way to destabilize India and through Kashmir. So that's the kind of historic allegation. Nothing has been presented that we can see that shows that these militants, were definitely backed by Pakistan, or that Pakistan, administration authorities had any awareness that this attack was going to take place.
And Pakistan denies involvement as well.
Pakistan completely denies involvement, but they have denied involvement in the past, so that, you can't rely on that as a kind of definite, a definite denial. But, what is true is that the targets that India then have kind of subsequently fired missiles at, some of them were known to be associated with these groups. So, the actual involvement of these two major militant groups in this attack is not clear, but it certainly historically has been the case in the past that they have committed atrocities in India.
So we still don't know exactly who was to blame for that attack on those Hindu tourists, mostly Hindu tourists. And there's this whole background of conflict over Kashmir, but this particular flashpoint really escalated quite quickly. We saw those missile and drone strikes from both sides, which you've described. Why did it escalate like this so rapidly?
I mean, it's a lot to do with kind of the government that's in power. The Modi government is a very kind of hyper-nationalist, hardline government. The fact that these attacks were seen to specifically target Hindus, single them out for their religion, was particularly inflammatory to a lot of India, but particularly to Modi's kind of base of Hindu nationalists. And there was this huge outcry and this sense that, Pakistan was to blame. That was the instant kind of assumption amongst everyone. And then also Pakistan has to suffer for what they've inflicted upon us. And so there was a huge call for retribution from, within the country, all across news channels, across, newspapers. It's very interesting. Kind of anti-Pakistan sentiment is something that, really unites an otherwise very polarized India. And so there were just calls for Modi to respond. And, that's pretty much what he said he'd do from the moment that these attacks happened. It did take them 2 weeks to actually hit back. There was a very kind of strange, I guess, lull before the storm where we all knew something was happening, but it was unclear how India would respond. And what they chose to do was launch missile strikes into Pakistan, but they claimed it was specifically just targeting terror camps and terror infrastructure belonging to groups that are known to have carried out attacks in India, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed and their kind of affiliates. And they said this was purely an attack on terror infrastructure. It was an attack on Pakistan's army. It was an attack on civilians. But, from Pakistan's side, civilians did die. Some of these targets were known to be more symbolic than actually, ones that still had functioning terror camps in them. And, any kind of invasion of Pakistan's territory is seen as an act of war, which is something that they said.
So it's quite an escalation for some decades. We are going to go to how things got calmed down with the US involvement. But before we do that, I want to ask you about the civilian toll inside Kashmir, because after that attack on the mostly Hindu tourists inside Indian-administered Kashmir, there was a security crackdown and people's homes were being demolished. It sounds like it was quite difficult after that moment for people living there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very familiar story to people in Indian-administered Kashmir. As soon as there is a militant attack, the entire civilian population is made to suffer for it. They're all essentially cast as militants or militant associates. And there are already a lot of very stringent laws that allow military and police to act kind of without any bounds, really, there. So what we saw after this attack was, thousands of people just getting absolutely rounded up by police, thrown into jails, beaten for 4 or 5 days for information. We saw the homes of those who were deemed to be associated with militants just blown up, as a sort of form of punishment. And they're just a kind of real mood of fear gripped the entirety of Indian administered Kashmir in that time, in that week afterwards. And then as soon as the India missile strikes hit into Pakistan, that region was also the first to suffer, because they're the ones with the villages along the border where, massive amounts of aggressive shelling and firing started from over the Pakistan border. And we still haven't got the exact death toll, but it's definitely dozens or hundreds who died just, going about their daily lives along the border.
Don't go anywhere, because we've got more full story on the other side of this break. But in the meantime, if you want to support The Guardian's fearless and independent journalism, please like and subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, or head to the links in the description. So, Hannah, we have a ceasefire. A tentative one. I'm sure everyone's hoping it will hold. And we heard it was brokered partly by the United States, which was a surprise, because the US Vice President J.D. Vance said at one point, "This is fundamentally none of our business," quote. So we thought they weren't going to get involved. What changed?
Well, the same thing that's, got every other US president involved in these conflicts. A realization that, India and Pakistan going to war is not just India and Pakistan going to war. It's the threat of nuclear war across, which would infect, not only Asia, but the whole world. And that these two countries cannot be trusted to, basically, I guess, bring each other to peace, to step back from the brink. These are such kind of existential ideas of, the idea of fighting back against Pakistan and India, that it's very much, it's always been very difficult for the two sides to kind of come to a resolution themselves. And this happened in the past. I mean, you've had instances of, Bill Clinton being on the phone to the, Pakistani Prime Minister at 4 a.m. trying to talk them down. I mean, almost every Secretary of State has had to do this at some point. So even though, Trump and J.D. Vance, they have this kind of non-involvement, philosophy of foreign policy, ultimately, I think they realized that they just couldn't, and that the only party that was acceptable to both sides to bring them back was America.
You mean because Saudi Arabia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, the UK, we know they were all kind of involved. Are you saying that just wasn't working and the US needed to come to the party?
Yeah, so the thing is none of those countries hold the same sway, hold the same influence over both sides. It's in neither of their interests to annoy America, to get on the wrong side of America. And so threats made by America in terms of saying, they won't cooperate with these countries if they don't agree to a ceasefire is a genuinely real threat for India and Pakistan. And they're seen as a kind of neutral observer. They don't, whereas China, Saudi Arabia, the UK just isn't powerful enough. A lot of these countries, as much as the UK wants to be a player, it absolutely is not. And it's got the historical kind of, sensitivities of the UK getting involved are too much for them to be able to push on either side.
I thought it was interesting that I read some analysis saying, because both Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons, it actually keeps some of the fighting in check. But from what you're saying, it was the fear that these countries would use these nuclear weapons that forced the US to get involved.
I mean, that's the idea of nuclear, right? It's supposed to be this kind of deterrent. But, I think what, Trump and the Trump administration realize is that in this case, it's not necessarily so much of a deterrent, because as soon as one side sees a kind of threat, what they call it the kind of escalation ladder, the ladder towards nuclear, it moves very quickly. It moves much more quickly than it does in other conflicts. And so in this instance, when India filed missiles towards an army base in Rawalpindi, which is, the military headquarters, but also where, the headquarters of a unit who look after Pakistan's nuclear warheads is based. That is already seen as a nuclear antagonism. And, the Pakistan Prime Minister called a meeting of the body that oversee control of Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Then meeting never took place because of the negotiations with the US.
The fact that meeting was called just shows how things were escalating.
Yeah, and in his speech, Modi kind of referenced this when he said India won't tolerate any nuclear blackmail.
कोई भी न्यूक्लियर ब्लैकमेल भारत नहीं सहेगा। न्यूक्लियर ब्लैकमेल की आड़ में पनप रहे आतंकी ठिकानों पर भारत सटीक और निर्णायक प्रहार करेगा.
So I think there is a sense on the Indian side that Pakistan were kind of using the nuclear as a way in which to kind of, justify an escalation, but also I think justify the involvement of the US.
So where we are now, I suppose the real question, apart from whether the ceasefire will hold, is whether there's any long-term solution for Kashmir. Now, you've referenced that there's already going to be talks between the two countries as part of the ceasefire. Are they going to talk about Kashmir at all and how to resolve this?
It's the big question. I mean, Pakistan certainly hopes they will. And Modi, again, his speech said, if we speak, we will speak to them about, they call it Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. And very possibly. I mean, the difficulty is that, Pakistan sees this as a dispute which should have international involvement. They see the international community as a necessary moderator in this, and they feel like, that there needs to be particularly the UN involved, whereas India sees it as a sovereign issue, one that can only be discussed bilaterally with Pakistan. They're very, very clear that they don't want any outside involvement. And so when Donald Trump sent, a message on his Truth Social platform on Sunday saying, I really want to help the two sides with he called it a 1,000-year-old dispute over Kashmir, which
Not quite.
is a little bit of a push. Not quite, but it's still a long-running one, that's for sure. That was welcomed by Pakistan, but it wasn't even commented on by India. That's their idea that, that's absolutely their worst nightmare.
It's still intractable. I mean, you've told us what Kashmiris want, that they like the idea of some form of autonomy. But is there an appetite in Pakistan and in India to resolve this at the moment?
In Kashmir, yes. They're always on the front lines. They're the first to suffer when, in any kind of conflict. They really want this to be resolved because for them, this ceasefire they've seen it so many times before. It's, international powers come in, they force India and Pakistan to lay down their arms, but then nothing else happens. And then, some flare up happens. And then, once again, they're the ones who are suffering. They're the ones that are suffering crackdowns. They're the ones that are suffering militant attacks. They're the ones that are suffering drones and missiles being launched, at their homes and villages. So on the ground, that's the thing that everyone was saying to us when we spoke to people. People were celebrating, but they were also like, this can't keep going on. This just is an endless cycle of violence. But that same message is not being reflected at the kind of top levels, particularly in India.
Hannah, I'm sure there's more to come on this very old conflict that's reached quite a dangerous point, but we'll have to check in with you again as things continue to develop. Thank you for your time today, though.
Thank you so much.